My work is both figurative and vessel-based. I'm inspired by stories and myths and by the natural world. A story or a certain dynamic will impress me, and I become intrigued as to how I can represent that in a physical way. Ceramics is 3D and very physical. When I was about 9, I lived a couple of doors over from a ceramic artist who taught classes in her basement studio. She taught me to build very basic rudiments of hand building, and that's where I learned to love clay. Many years later, as an art major in college, I learned the potter's wheel and I loved that, but I didn't stay with it. All my work is built by hand. You can see this isn't a perfect square that perhaps should be a block. I'm going to keep that because it might be interesting when I roll it out. I like these spontaneous shapes. I used to try to keep everything more squared up as I worked, but I realized the things that happen without my knowing they're going to happen become the most interesting pieces. In general, I don't plan out the works in advance. I might do pencil sketches or spend a few minutes on a maquette just to establish how the elements might align and have direction, but I don't really follow my plan with any precision. I don't need to know ahead of time what will happen. Years ago, I realized that as I worked to cut a deliberate shape from a slab of clay, that I was much more drawn to the scraps of clay I was discarding than I was to the deliberate shape. I couldn't bear to discard these interesting scraps, so I began to roll them out, stamp them, and work them into my sculptures, and to love the random configurations that I would never be able to think up if I had a plan. I've always been simultaneously interested in painting and ceramics, and how I work with glaze, I think, therefore, on ceramics is informed by what I've learned as a painter. When glazing, I use the sensibilities of a painter, even though glazes don't act at all like paint. Typically, glazes look nothing at all like what they're going to look like once they're fired. So you have to develop a knack for working with a pretty much monochromatic palette, even as you imagine how that palette's going to transform into other colors. That visualization process actually gets harder and harder to do as I apply the glaze. This is a sampling of glazes before they're fired here and when they're fired here. This very icy blue color will, once it's fired, be completely colorless. These three here, which look a lot alike before they're fired, are going to actually fire to be greenish, turquoise, and yellowish colors. And this lovely little pale, almost barely perceptible violet color will become a beautiful deep blue when it's fired. I like to explore with commercial glazes and how they react to each other when they're layered or when they're fired up or cooled down at various speeds. The results can really vary. I'm constantly pushing what I know is most likely to happen with the gamble that if I break the rules a little, something amazing will happen. Trial and error can either bring me a gorgeous result or a total loss. That's one reason why I started making a lot of bowls. I can make a bowl so quickly that if trial and error fails, I haven't lost a piece that I spent days and days making. People ask when they see my figurative work, especially faces, how long did that take and what did I begin with? While the time ranges from hours to days for any particular piece, the beginning is always with a lump of clay. One thing that can be time-consuming for me is eyes, because there are two of them that have to match. I can rough out the whole face pretty quickly, but it can be challenging to make the eyes symmetrical. There's no rule that says eyes have to be realistic. And yet when they are, I feel so much more engaged with the sculpted face. It's almost as if in the real world, I can't stare intently into someone's eyes, at least not for long. But when I sculpt a face, there's something fulfilling about creating eyes that I really can look deeply into. So I guess what I'm saying is that I do want eyes to be realistic. My figurative work might originate in the domain of a what-if narrative. One narrative I've sculpted several times reframes the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden and asks the question, what if the first woman on earth were not viewed through the lens of original sin? What if there were an upside to her eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? I imagine Eve as a woman free to seek knowledge, free to ask questions about good and evil that could contribute to being able to maintain paradise rather than to being banished from it. Eve could read to her heart's content, immersed in nature as represented by the fig leaf, the apple, the branches of the tree, and even by the snake as a benign creature in nature, not as Satan in disguise. Another what-if narrative involves endangered species. Temple of the Sacred Bee asks the question, what if bees were holy? What if nature were so respected by humanity that temples were erected to bees because without them, life on earth as we know it couldn't exist? With figurative works, it may be that I'll have an emotional moment and I'll want to create a lasting impression of it. It could be a concern for the plight of feral cats, or it might be the awe of spotting a creature in the wild, or a glimpse of some little magical feeling I have when a ladybug lands on my hand. Shaping the clay, it's as if I'm being dictated to by a feeling, perhaps that of compassion, or love, or beauty that wants to be expressed. I'm very inspired by and have great reverence for the masters from cultures all around the world that created the kind of vessels we see in museums, the classic antiquities. And it's not just because these vessels are beautiful, but they're kind of a touchstone for me. In fact, some of them were very plain earthenware vessels. Many ancient vessels have features to them that we just don't see today. To me, there's an air of mystery as to how they functioned. Like obsolete tools, I find myself wondering exactly how they were used. Something about that just draws me in. Vessels are symbolic in that they're meant to hold something, and the mere suggestion of that potential is very appealing. Dating back to prehistory, a vessel could be an ordinary container for water, or it could be associated with a religious ritual, probably in the sense that the body is a vessel and the container of the soul. I like to portray the vessel as the container of a narrative, and I love the concept that there's something unknown in every vessel, just as there's something unknown in every person we see that we may never get to see. Sometimes I'll build something inside the vessel that the viewer's not expecting to see, which hints at that symbolism. When I build holes and cracks into a vessel, it gives me a sense that it's open to the viewer in more ways than one. If I close it up with a narrow neck, for example, then the inner realm of that form is nothing more than a dark unknown space. Yet if the light falls a certain way through a crack or a hole, there might be a glimpse into it. I don't think it's essential that the viewers see in my work what I see in my work, especially with my original intent in creating it. As long as the viewer has their own takeaway, then they enjoy the work. That's what's important to me. But in the end, whatever my original intent may be, I just want there to be something complex or interesting to think about, whether it's the story, whether it's humor, or something beautiful, or just something that the viewer sees that I would have never anticipated.